Question under consideration is to compare and contrast the scrutiny rules of the UK Parliament and the United States Congress. Our response to this question must first delineate the political meaning of scrutiny. Whilst not directly the same as the legislative rule, most chapters in US and UK politics textbooks refer to the scrutinising of legislation by the legislature. The scrutiny rule also involves matters such as appointments, scrutinising treaties, monitoring the performance of government departments, specifically monitoring foreign policy, and holding members of the executive to account. A fundamental point must be made. In the US, the Congress, as the first branch of government, as outlined in Article 1, has primarily a legislative role. However, constitutional scholars like Polsby or Nelson Polsby have recognised that the scrutiny rule has emerged out of what is called the implied oversight powers, not directly mentioned in the Constitution. In that sense, rather like the Supreme Court and judicial review, the Congress has claimed scrutiny or oversight powers beyond that which was written down. The UK scrutiny or oversight powers, and indeed in the UK system, there's been one in which, due to the powers being devolved from the monarchy to the political executive, and a system shored up by party loyalty, the scrutiny of the executive and scrutiny powers of Parliament as a whole have tended to be gradually wrested from a strong executive. An area of obvious contrast is that of appointments. In the United States, the Senate has the constitutional duty to advise and consent to nominations that the President makes to the executive and judicial branches of government, for instance. For example, Tom Daschle, who was Obama's first choice as Health Secretary, withdrew because evidence of tax irregularities was likely to be investigated at the Senate hearings. Even Catherine Sebelius, who was confirmed by the Senate, faced embarrassing revelations about failures to make tax returns and was only confirmed by 65 to 31 votes, highlighting the important role of scrutiny in relation to appointments. Whilst the process of approving appointments is largely a matter of course, the President does sometimes fail, and high-profile examples like that of John Tower under Bush Sr. and the rejection of Robert Bork by the Senate as a Reagan nominee for the Supreme Court recognise that the Congress, or more precisely the Senate, does jealously guard its independent powers to scrutinise appointments. It should also be noted that the filibuster gives the minority in the Senate, now functioning due to Scott Brown's recent election, a significant oversight power with respect to appointments. When in the minority under Bush, the Democrats were able to, for instance, filibuster several judicial appointments. There is no formal parliamentary mechanism for approving or rejecting appointments made by the Prime Minister. When recently, under the last Labour government, Peter Mandelson was elevated to the House of Lords as Business Secretary, there was little that Parliament could do, and it was left to the commentators and the press to scrutinise the appointment and raise questions about Mandelson's suitability. If Obama had been thinking of nominating someone like Mandelson into the US cabinet, question marks over ethics might have made him think twice. The whole issue of scrutiny depends upon independence, and in some respects the US and UK systems compare here. It is only when there is so-called divided government in the US that scrutiny of the executive is meaningful. Otherwise, as Anthony Bennett remarks, the whole business of scrutiny turns from making Congress less a watchdog and more a lapdog. The point has been further developed by Ornstein and Mann in Congress, The Broken Branch, which has been highly critical of the way in which the Republican-dominated Congress between 2000 and 2006 failed to exercise scrutiny or oversight over the Bush administration with respect to such issues as terrorism. They use evidence such as the decline of the House and Senate, in the House and Senate oversight hearings from 782 to 1983, when Reagan faced the Democrats in the House, to only 287 in 1997, when Clinton faced the Republicans. The point is that whilst Bennett may be right about the need for divided government for effective oversight, or scrutiny, that the trend has been for the Senate and House, regardless of party dominance, to abdicate its responsibilities to the exercise scrutiny in its key areas. They point out that during the 2003-2004 period, there were no hearings in Congress with respect to Afghanistan. Though he clearly faces problems, Obama is in a much stronger position than, say, Clinton between 1994 and 2000, or Bush after 2006, since he can rely upon legislative majorities in both houses, and thus a much more sympathetic scrutiny. Although during the midterms of 2010, he actually lost this majority in the House of Representatives. In the UK, scrutiny of the executive is often highlighted in various ministerial question times, and most notably PMQs. This is due to the separation of powers, and there's no US equivalent of these proceedings. However, critics like Matthew Paris, here on the right, suggest that these questions times present a semblance of scrutiny, but that the minister faces little effective scrutiny. Ministers often face favourable or patsy questions. Most of the PMQs is political theatre. And the general lack of a right of reply and the many gambits that ministers play to dodge giving answers such as national security, no longer in my remit, too expensive, and commercial confidentiality make the whole process of scrutiny at this level something of a sham. However, there is no direct US equivalent, and the need for ministers to appear in front of either Commons or Lords to deal with controversial matters of the day, such as the failure in the last government of David Miliband to protect evidence suggesting torture of terror suspects, does add weight to the view that this is a form of scrutiny that is still important. The main vehicle for scrutiny in both legislatures is committees. In the United States, the main committees for providing scrutiny are the standing committees, such as Armed Services and Appropriations. Since these are permanent, unlike the main legislative committees in the House of Commons, they tend to develop a policy expertise. Thus, the Senate Armed Services Committee castigated the Bush administration for its routine use of torture of terrorist detainees. The House and Senate were also responsible for a damning report in the response of FEMA to Hurricane Katrina, and its head, Michael Brown, was forced to resign. In the UK, the departmental select committees are the main vehicle for scrutiny oversight, but critics such as Grant point out that it is like all things in the Commons, party-dominated, poorly resourced, lacking legislative powers to back up its reports, and lacking key subpoena powers of witnesses and documents. Compare, say, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Commons with the Foreign Relations Committee in Congress, and it is clear that the UK committees have little access to documents, whilst the US committees are partners in the access to classified information with the administration or government. The Commons departmental select committees may not have the same powers as the US counterparts, but they have developed a reputation of independence, and people like John McFall and his Treasury Committee have provided an alternative viewpoint on the handling of the government of the banking crisis. It is also a point of comparison that both in the UK and in the US, this kind of committee work is held in the public domain, and usually televised. Philip Norton argues that the generally bipartisan nature of departmental select committees has allowed them to exercise significant influence, if not power, over government. However, there is no obligation on any government to debate the reports. They only have to give some written response to it within 3 months, and this contrasts markedly with their congressional counterparts. Here, reports like the one which emerged on the handling of the subprime lenders, and indeed the one on Toyota and its various failures in terms of the braking system, will carry the weight of a judicial inquiry and may lead to legislation and indeed criminal prosecutions. The US committees may be powerful, but are often bogged down in detail, dominated by staffers, and because there are some 200 subcommittees in Congress, they tend to cancel each other out, and many members of both House and Senate are on so many committees that they find it hard to keep track of the issues and perform the scrutiny rule effectively. Technically, both Parliament and Congress possess a significant scrutiny power of impeachment. However, it has been used in the US as with that of Clinton and the near impeachment of Nixon. In the UK, a Plaid Cymru MP, Elfyn Lwyd, attempted to use an ancient impeachment device to impeach Blair, but since this was the first attempt since 1848 to use it, it can be said to be a much less effective scrutiny device than its better known and more frequently used US counterpart. Arguably the most independent and informed source of scrutiny in the UK Parliament comes from the House of Lords. Although not having the same array of committees, commentators such as Donald Shell have highlighted how issues such as European directives have been well scrutinised in the Lords, and that given that no party has an overall majority in the Lords, it acts in a more independent way than the Commons. However, the Lords is fundamentally weakened due to its unelected nature, and any scrutiny it offers must be seen against the fact that it is a chamber in transition with no clear sign of when it will become wholly or partly elected. Another contrast is that of treaty ratification. There is no obligation on the government in the UK seeking parliamentary consent to a treaty. However, the reality in recent years has been for the government to seek and gain such approval. The Maastricht and Lisbon treaties, for example, were both debated and scrutinised by Parliament, though technically this was via debate and the vote itself was not formally binding. It should be pointed out that in terms of scrutiny of treaties, the Lords is a backseat passenger and not key to the scrutiny process at all. The US, via the Senate, is obliged to ratify by a 2/3 majority any treaty signed by the President. Since presidents tend to engage in executive agreements more than formal treaties, it could be said that the room for the Senate scrutiny is limited. However, the notable failure to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty highlights its potential strength of the Senate and requires considerable effort to gain the support of such a weighted majority and forces the President to adopt a bipartisan approach. In foreign policy, it can be argued the Congress, due to its co-equal status with the Presidency, is better equipped and constitutionally empowered to monitor foreign policy. Vietnam did much to reinvigorate the Congress through the Budget Impoundment Act and the War Powers Act. However, commentators such as Paulsby have noted that in times of crisis like that post 9/11, the scrutiny of foreign policy of the government tends to be weak, and Congress has conceded considerable ground to the President in the making conducting of foreign policy. In the UK, Parliament has been historically weak at scrutinising foreign policy, as the war-making power is essentially the remit of the executive. However, as with treaties, political reality has pressed Prime Ministers such as Thatcher, Major and Blair to seek consent from Parliament. The revelations of the Chilcot inquiry would tend to suggest that the decision to go to war against Iraq in 2003 was made with the Commons largely uninformed of the real threat, and thus highlighting its weak scrutiny role in this area. Finally, since scrutiny is also part of the legislative process, it is worth noting that Parliament as a whole, and the Lords in particular, are relatively weak. The executive determines the agenda. Some 80% of parliamentary time is spent on government bills. In the US, the scrutiny of legislation is largely shaped by the powerful committees in both houses, Ways and Means, Rules and Appropriations, and even more so by the chairs of such committees that can pigeonhole such legislation. The fact that some 5,000 bills proposed and only 300 become law indicates that the Congress is much more effective at scrutinising legislation with respect to killing it off, whilst Parliament, with a smaller legislative programme, spends insufficient time examining bills, the Lords having no scrutiny rights over money bills, and due to party whipping, it tends to process bills much quicker than Congress.